Welcome to Season 3 of Through the Word. We hope that this podcast will serve you as you grow to know and to love the Lord. Well, good day to you as you join us in our podcast once again. Thank you for joining us in People of the Promise, this look into the book of Genesis. And as you know, this is our second foray into the book of Genesis. We were in an earlier part as we got into the beginning of the book, and now we're partway through and well into the story of Abraham and now into the story of Lot. And so if you haven't had a chance to do so, grab your Bible. We're looking into Genesis 19 today. And I want to welcome Warren, pastor of Congregational Care, right?
Yeah.
And Luke, welcome back again.
Thanks, man.
And it's so good to have you guys here. This is one of the hardest texts in all the Bible. And I was really proud of our brother and our friend Matt, who preached on this text just a couple days ago, because this is one of the hardest texts to preach on, because it's a hard story to read. I just thought, let's talk about this just for a moment. How do you feel when you read this story? What does this do emotionally to us as we read Genesis 19 about the destruction of the city and the people that are there and the complexities of the relationships? What do you feel?
Yeah, well, for starters, you're right. It is super complex. We see the descent of Lot getting closer and closer to a context that's going to be compromising for him and his family. And I said to you before we started recording, it makes me really glad that I live on this side of the cross.
For sure.
Because it's so drastic. And I think in a good way, we talked about this a little bit before we hit record, but in a good way, it's one of those passages in the Bible that should cause us to say, wow, God is taking he's taking what's happening here tremendously seriously. Like this is a very black and white matter for God. And it prompts me to consider what that tells me both about the holiness of God, but also of the implications for why God invites us to be a people who are marked by obedience to Him. Those are just shooting from the hip, some of my initial thoughts. How about you, Warren?
Yeah, and I think I totally agree. And I think that there are other parts of me that kind of see this, and I think we sometimes ask those questions like, could God have done something else? Is there some other measure that God could have done to maybe, God went to such great lengths to send Jesus to the cross, but here now, He wipes out this whole city, and is there another way that could have been approached? And we kind of, I believe it's our nature to kind of ask those questions because we see it as such a drastic measure. But I agree with Luke. It goes back to how do we view God?
Yeah.
How do we view sin? And all of those things.
So let's get specific here. Let me read verses 24 and 25 for a moment for all of us. Verse 24 says, "Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land." So there's the short synopsis of the entire longer story in the chapter 19. So let's get a little more specific. Why does God destroy Sodom? Aren't there other cities, past and present, that are equally evil? How would we answer that question?
Wow. Maybe to lead off with a story that a commentator, Warren Wiersbe, shared that kind of helped me start to wrap my mind around this, is just this notion that oftentimes we are unaware of God's mercy and God's grace in our lives, and even sometimes the mercy and grace that we're experiencing of people around us. And we can be unaware of how close we are to destruction, how close we are to a choice that could change our lives. Sometimes you interact with people and they'll reference a point in their lives and they'll say, you know what, I could have joined this friend group, or I could have accepted that job, or I could have, and it just, I felt like God was pointing me in a different direction. It didn't make sense at the time, but now looking back, I'm so glad that. We hear these kind of stories and testimonies, and oftentimes, if it's not a life or death situation, we don't always recognize how much mercy is being afforded to us. In August of 1940, Winston Churchill made a famous speech to the British Parliament, and he was honoring the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, who was fighting the Luftwaffe, who at that time were conducting the Battle of Britain, were trying to just raze all of the British major cities to the ground. And he said, never in history has so much been owed by so many to so few. And what Churchill is getting at is saying these fighter pilots are putting themselves in a position where they could die. They're actually taking the hit. And it's so that we on the ground can actually be protected and saved and preserved. But if they don't, day after day, night after night, go up on these fighting sorties, like we're hopeless, we're toast, we're lost. And what's compelling about that when I think about this example is that you see for these people in Sodom and Gomorrah that they don't realize what they're dealing with. They don't realize the danger of their sin. They don't recognize the imminent threat, and that if it's not for Abraham interceding and asking God to spare these people, that destruction is imminent, that they are really facing some very severe things. And so what happens for them is they totally lose sight of the mercy of God. It would be like the British people saying, yeah, we don't actually have to fund or support or endorse the RAF. We don't need this covering of mercy over us. We don't need to be in support of a certain way of life in order to actually thrive. We're convinced that our way of life, our culture, our pleasurable pursuits are good, normal, right, and healthy. And God is saying, no, you don't realize how close you are to destruction, how much this way of life is not just going to corrupt you, but if it keeps going, might corrupt all of the civilized world in that point in time. And God's saying, I can't let that happen.
Thoughts on that point, Warren?
Yeah, no, I think Luke makes a good point. And I think also, too, that we get from the text that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah had reached a certain limit. It was such a great outcry.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
And when we look at that, we see, I was looking back, and in Genesis 15, it talks about the Amorites and this idea that their evil had not reached its full measure. And so God hadn't dealt with it at that time. And so in terms of this outcry, I think it had reached a certain level. And I heard the expression.
You wonder who was doing the outcrying.
Yeah, that's right.
It doesn't really say that.
No, but it was so concerning about the level of evilness and wickedness that it was prevailing in the city.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where God had to intervene. And God just goes back to God's mercy. We can't take God's mercy for granted and realize his justice as well has limits.
Yeah.
What he can tolerate, because he's a holy God. And so when we look at this, it had reached a certain measure where God felt he had to intervene. And I heard the expression of irretrievable evil, almost like Romans 1:32, when it talks about, it gets to the point where they not only do evil, but they approve of others and almost persuade others and influence others. And so God obviously saw it at a certain point where it had reached a point where he could no longer tolerate.
And we saw that, didn't we?
Yeah.
All the men of the city gathered around that house door, calling for Lot to send out the angels. And like,
Lot
entire
was, in
city
fact,
was
the only man in that city who was not participating in the way the whole city was in this wickedness.
I was just going to add, and I agree with what Warren said, and just for many of us, I think in church circles, we know that we need forgiveness and we value God's designs of forgiveness in the world. And sometimes we can not balance that out with realizing that God cares tremendously about justice and that every person will be held accountable for what they've done with their lives, especially if they're looking to Jesus Christ or not for that forgiveness. And it gives me comfort, and should give us comfort, to realize that right now in 2024, when we look at our world and see evil people getting away with evil things, that they will have to ultimately answer to God for that. That they won't ultimately get away with that.
We will all give an account, won't we?
And so in this matter, it's one example of just realizing, like, what's happening here is terrible. There's things going on that we inevitably don't even know about that are just awful. And God is saying, listen, you're not going to ultimately get away with this. There's justice in the face of evil. And for those of us who can relate to maybe some of the people who are crying out and saying, God, intervene, there's so much evil here, who can relate to experiences where tremendous evil has been perpetuated against us, to be able to say, hey, God, no matter what, God is ultimately going to hold these people to account. And that is a good thing.
Yeah. And I think God uses as an example this as Sodom and Gomorrah, because there's all kinds of other passages that talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, almost like as if this is like a remembrance of this is what happens to the ungodly. And I think in 2 Peter it talks about that. Like this is actually done. God used Sodom and Gomorrah and the destruction of them as a reminder to people that this is how God punishes the ungodly.
So you've segued us well.
Yeah.
Warren, thank you for that. Here's the second question that relates to the first. So we talked about the destruction in question 1, but what about Lot? He was actually saved from that destruction. And yet we see him as probably being contaminated in the city. The Bible says he was sitting at the gate of the city, which means he was in some kind of influential position.
Like a counselor.
Probably, right? And we see his sons-in-law were not living well, and yet 2 Peter actually says he was righteous. Let me read 2 Peter for a minute. But here's the question to think about as I read this. Why was Lot saved? Was he not also contaminated by the sinful culture? So let me just explore what Peter writes about him. 2 Peter chapter 2. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he heard and saw. If this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. Interesting picture of the history of Israel from Peter's perspective. But let's come back to that question. Is there not a dichotomy here of Lot's sinful nature, and yet he was spared?
Yeah. What do you think, Warren?
Well, I think when you look at what the scriptures say there, it actually tells us that he was described as righteous. And I think I've heard some say, was it because Abraham, who was already had faith in God and was credited to him as righteousness, as he intervened for Lot, was that how it was credited to Lot? But it actually says that he was disturbed within his righteous soul, Lot's own soul. And the fact that he was distressed by filthy lives of lawless men, day after day tormented in his righteous soul by the wicked deeds that he saw and heard, right? So he was disturbed within. And how much if we look at our own lives and we actually point back to ourselves, how much do we look at our lives as Christians, and we live in a context sometimes that there's evil, the presence of evil, and what do we do about it? And we can easily sit back and judge Lot, but Lot might have been one of the people crying out to the Lord as to what to do, because you figure every single male was in that picture. He was the only one. How alienating is that? And isolating. So I think, we do get a clear picture that from Scripture, at least what Paul declares there, is that he was righteous, or Peter, he was righteous. Yeah.
And yet he offered his daughters.
Yeah.
Which is messed up.
Which is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Right.
I think, we said a few moments ago that God will bring justice and evil people won't get away with evil forever. And the other side of that coin is just to recognize that, then we'll be obviously held to account. I'll be held to account. I can't just point at, drug lords in South America or, fill in the blank, these people who are notorious for evil things, and say, wow, you've really got it coming. I've got it coming, if not for Jesus Christ. And so what's encouraging for me is that the truth is there have been times in my life where I have parallels in my conduct in some ways to Lot. Now, you might say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, we see Lot being really comfortable and cozying up next to a sinful context and sinful people. Have I done that in my own life? Have there been ways where I've been vigilant in relationships, in media consumption, in fill in the blank? Or have I been passive at times? And Lot's a bit passive. I stand guilty of that. I don't have any daughters, and the situation described here, like you said, is pretty extreme. But for us to stop and say, have I been willing, because of disobedience to God, because of drifting into sin or irresponsibility or just spiritual apathy, have I been willing to sacrifice people around me in a way, to use people around me to try and get my way out of a messy situation, I'm reacting instead of responding, so to speak, because I'm facing a circumstance that has been building over time because of consequential choices I've made that have been worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Have I been there? Absolutely. And so what does God do in the midst of that? God shows Lot tremendous mercy. He's
Grace.
Not a hero here.
Yeah.
He's given this incredible second chance. And in a way, it almost feels like if anything could be given to Lot's credit, he's at least semi-open to listening to God. He doesn't totally shut off and ignore God, in contrast with the men around him who are willing, ultimately, this kind of destruction, we've got to realize there's not this part of them where they're looking to be saved. They're looking to be integrous. They're looking to follow God. They're getting what they're living towards, if that makes sense. Like a person who has countless opportunities to change their behavior to seek help surrounding a toxic addiction and just keeps shutting down support, keeps neglecting help, and ultimately their body shuts down. Why? They're making choices towards a destructive end. These people are making spiritual choices, relational choices, communal choices towards a destructive end.
So yeah, why was Lot saved ultimately? Because of God's grace and love.
Yeah.
I mean, Abraham wasn't perfect either, and yet he rescued him. David was by no means perfect in his life, and yet he was called a man of faith too, and a man after God's own heart. So that even itself gives us such hope, I think.
Yeah.
Because we are not perfect,
Yeah.
and yet God's grace is sufficient as we come to him. Hey, let's move on to question 3.
Sure.
I'm going to read verse 14 for us. It says, "So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were pledged to marry his daughters. He said, 'Hurry, get out of this place because the Lord is about to destroy the city.' But his sons-in-law thought he was joking." I thought it was interesting how Matt approached this verse on Sunday. And he really did say, and it seems like the text is saying to us, that the sons-in-law kind of just laughed this off a bit. And I wonder if they were kind of sensing, well, it's a boys will be boys attitude toward all the men outside the door and toward their own conduct in the midst of it all. So here's the question. Lot's sons-in-law laughed at the warning, at this warning that they had to get out of the city. But why is sin no laughing matter? We've already talked a little bit about it. But here's the second question. Was God unjust in punishing Lot's wife when they were leaving? Why is sin no laughing matter? Why were the boys wrong in what they did? And I think the text even says it. It appears that Lot's sons-in-law perished because they didn't come out with Lot. Only the daughters came out.
Yeah.
They were judged too. Yeah, why is it wrong to laugh at sin?
Yeah, what would you say, Warren?
Well, I think that it goes back to what we had talked about before, is how do we view God and who God is, and understanding one aspect of God is he's a holy God, and that sin is the exact opposite of holiness. It's actually countering against God and saying, I don't believe in holiness. I don't accept righteousness. I'm going against your will. And God takes sin very seriously. Even in the very beginning, the Bible talks about in Ezekiel that the soul that sins, it shall die. And the fact that when even Adam and Eve sinned against God, I think we sometimes wonder when we see the outcome of sin, we think, oh, why does God punish sin the way he does? But the question really probably should be is, how does God tolerate our rebellion against him, a holy God who can't tolerate the presence of sin? But we ask the other side of the question when really we should be questioning it from that perspective, because God can't tolerate being in the presence of sin, and sin needs to be dealt with, and takes sin very seriously. And we see it here in this exact story, right? What measures God will go to.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I mentioned to you that the whole frog in the kettle analogy about how you can ultimately boil a frog by putting it in a kettle. This sounds sadistic, but just bear with me. It's just an illustration. And if it's lukewarm water, if you start to heat it slowly over time, it'll go up to boiling temperature. And because of how frogs' skin works and how like water can pass in and out through their skin, they'll ultimately boil to death, but they'll never take action to get out of the pot. Because it's so slowly that the water's getting warmer and warmer around them. And that's clearly what's evidenced here. There's this caution to us to say, hey, just because something is culturally accepted, just because the people around us treat certain lifestyles as the norm, doesn't actually mean it's okay. And what we underestimate often as people is that we assume that things that are familiar to us are good and integrous, when sometimes they really seriously need to be re-examined. Another piece that I just think is telling here is that in John 1, Jesus is described as the Word, as the living Word. But what's consequential is that in Genesis 19, God's Word, if you will, a word is given to Lot for his saving, for his rescue, for his salvation. And Lot, as faltering and messy and complex as he is, he ultimately acts on the Word. He receives the Word, and he acts on the Word and shares that word of rescue, which in this instance is get out of the city, with these other people, and they reject the Word. They don't receive it.
Yeah.
And so it's a microcosm pointing us ahead to Jesus, the living Word, saying, like, at the end of the day, God's grace to us is that he gives us Christ. He gives us the living Word. Ultimately, we can't save ourselves, but we can receive that Word, and on receiving that Word, act on and share that Word. But there's people around us who will hear the Word, but who may not receive it, who may reject it at their own expense.
Yeah, that the idea of God's holiness is so clear here, isn't it? He is a holy and just God, and we are not. And we just know that as unholy people, we can never approach God unless he intervenes and shares his grace and love and draws us to holiness, to righteousness, like he did for Abraham and for Lot in this text. So let's wrap it up here as we think about moving forward to the cross.
Yeah.
Because we can't stay here in the Old Testament. We can't stay here in Sodom and Gomorrah. This text leads us to something that will come, that will fix that problem forever. And we are living in that day for sure. This story highlights the extremes of human sinfulness and God's judgment against sin. There's no ambiguity here. This story also directs our spiritual longings to the New Testament and when Christ would come as the once-for-all sacrifice for sin, the once-for-all penalty for sin. And I hope that you, where you're watching, are celebrating the Lord's goodness to you in this regard, even today. The darkness of Sodom and its destruction is juxtaposed against the brilliance of God's love and in its incarnation in the person of Jesus Christ. And we got to see that in this text, I think. Let me lead us at the end here to Romans 3. Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." But the very next verse gives us the antidote. What's it say? "We are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ." So there's some good news in the midst of this dark story. So child of God, be encouraged today. The Lord loves you. His grace is sufficient. Lean into that and walk away from your life of sin. And we all need to do the same and walk toward the light of Christ. God bless you. We'll see you next time. For more episodes of these podcasts, find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Emmanuel Plus on YouTube.